Hey folks, welcome to our first video lecture in what will be a series of about 5 or 6 for the remaining portion of the semester. So today we're going to talk about a couple of genres, fantasy, sci-fi, and the superhero sort of world, and how those things enable us a kind of space apart from everyday life. Tears a little. If you ever played the video game Portal, I always imagine it being like that. We're able to just sort of rip a little hole, a kind of porthole in the fabric of reality, step into it, and as a result, out of daily life, and to have just a much needed break. You may be feeling that right now a lot. I actually think this is very apropos. This topic with everything that's going on. 2020's only in March, and my goodness, it's been a year, right? So let's get started. Now, before we talk about those specific things, I'm going to do this just about every single lecture, which is to say, give you a very explicit list of due dates and stuff you got to do by Sunday, because everything that's anytime anything's due, it's going to be due on Sunday now that we're online. Okay, so what do you need to do by 11:59 on Sunday, March 29th? Good question. This is what you have to do. So you need to read these things. So first, read Chris Brawley's article on Tolkien. Then watch the link there. It's provided both on the updated syllabus as well as if you go under course readings on the D2L website. Click course readings, click week 10. There's a link. Click it. It'll take you directly to the video. It's a short. It's pretty interesting about. That's about time travel. I don't want to say too much more beyond that. And then finally, read Andrew Ballman's text. Okay, so if you are anyone in class, you will read those things or watch and consume those things. And then if you haven't already completed all of your notes for the weekly reading notes assignment, take notes on those things, plop them in a Word document, upload them as a PDF, a doc file, or a docx file onto D2L in the weekly reading notes Dropbox. You're good to go. All right. If you are Jeff, a Grant, or a Kiwana, then you have more to do for this week, which will also be due by Sunday. So on Sunday, those 3 individuals, you will have to upload something into the discussion leader supplements. When I say something, that's super vague. Let me say what I mean. It could be you could create a handout. You could stare lifelessly, soullessly into the camera of your computer and create a kind of podcast where you verbally or even visually, I guess, work through what the article or assigned text or video that you had for that week was all about. What's it getting at? What's it trying to get at? Why do you think I, as the instructor, assigned it and tried, why am I assigning this? What do you think? You might bring some examples to the table. You could also create a PowerPoint. I think for most people, PowerPoint will suffice, might be the easiest, lowest hanging fruit because it's very concrete. You make some slides, maybe 5 or 6 slides, where you explain some of the concepts. Maybe you introduce the author or the creator of the content. You explain what it did, what it's about, and then maybe some repercussions, like why does this matter? But anyway, you'll upload those to the discussion leader supplements. If you hear me take a pause, because I'm taking a drink of water. All right. Genre. So in order to kind of talk about these 3 different types of genre, we have to have a clear definition of what we mean. Genre is it originates from French, meaning kind, a category, a type, a class, form, a sort. It's often used as a descriptive term. It's thinking of it as like little silos or little bins, and you are able to distinguish what kinds of features a text has and chuck it into those different bins. Now, if we think through Mikhail Bakhtin, who we talked a little bit about when we talked about intertextuality, previewed it way earlier in the semester, and we'll talk about him later in the semester, he thought about genre as a kind of creative force. It's an engine that helps not only us interpret text in particular ways, based on every single text we've ever seen in our entire life, but it also helps us produce text in relation to every text that we've ever read or consumed or been near in our entire life. All right, so anyway, genre. This person who looks a lot like, in my opinion, not physically, but in his terms of his posing in this photo, a little bit like Golem, who's just discovered he now has possession of the ring. He's a really important rhetorician. This quote is something that is the title of this week's heading for the syllabus. So literature is equipment for living. This is a phrase that I am quite attached to and love and think it's good to think with. So literature, or text if you want to think about it that way, or even if you want to broaden it out beyond just literary content, words on pages, you could think of that as patterns of expression or communicative genres. So, like listening to a new, uh, your new favorite artist's album, that could be used. You could think of that as functioning as equipment for living. We'll explain what that means in a second. Or playing a new video game. Doom Eternal just came out, as did, oh my god, what's the name of the other one? Animal Crossings. Animal Crossing. Both of those games just came out. Both of those could function as equipment for living for you. A new book could, a video game, some sort of content could come out and kind of help you. So, one of the things Burke is arguing is these pieces of culture, these textual bits, or these expressions arise from and exist in relation to social and lived reality. They are produced by and as a result reflect and shape reality, culture, and reality. So, literature, one of the things he's arguing is literature can help readers understand and make sense of their day to day experiences. It can kind of act as a guide or a tool. It can help you do things just like a screwdriver can help you accomplish some social goal, some social act. Same thing with a book. As if you're 13, you're a young person, you probably had a book that helped you through this. You're going through this coming of age, going into puberty, shifting from K through 12 educational system up to middle school and then high school and then later into college. All of those transitional periods in your life, oftentimes you'll find a book or a piece of content online. Maybe it's a meme. Memes could be equipment for a living. Maybe it's a meme that's about that kind of stage in life where you're not exactly sure, you don't have a good grasp on what the hell's happening. You know that things are changing in your life. Well, that text, you could find some book that helps you. I have done that throughout my entire life. I'll find a book that helps me figure out and orient myself, and it gives me guidance, and it's a good tool. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of genres, like I said at the top of the video. One being fantasy. So it emerges around, there's no definitive explicit date of in 1801 fantasy emerges, boom. It's not that simple. But it emerges around the mid 1800s, reviving the medieval chivalric romance. Chivalric coming from chivalry, right? This quest, King Arthur, if you want to think about it, something like that. This Arthurian legend of a hero on an epic quest who is aided by friends and also thwarted by his various enemies, probably finding a various number of magical things and fighting off demons and dragons and all that sort of stuff. Eventually meeting his quest and learning something very valuable about life and friendship along the way. I'm being facetious, but something like that, right? Here are some examples of very early fantasy novels, or fantasy texts. So John Ruskin's *The King of the Golden River*, 1841. George MacDonald, *The Princess and the Goblin*, 1872. Here's William Morris with. If you don't know who William Morris is, I don't want to explain too much. Just Google William Morris and then go to Google image search and check out some of these beautiful, highly ornate. He and his company made tapestries and all sorts of really interesting. You can get wallpapers. You can even get a cell phone cover that's a William Morris style cell phone cover. Anyway, *The Wood Beyond the World*, 1894, and then one that you probably are certainly familiar with, at least in its terms of its filmic adaptation, is first J.R.R. Tolkien's *The Hobbit*, which came out in 1937, and then the *Lord of the Rings* series, which came out in 1954 and then 55, but was written from sort of 1937 to 1949. A lot of these kinds of texts, these fantasies texts, have a reaction, a kind of romantic look back into the past as a reaction against the rise of modernity, the ecological impacts, the emergence of industrial revolution, and what it does. It disrupts daily life. So a lot of these, if you look at Skyrim on the left or the Witcher series, the dates on the Witcher is a little complicated because it's a book series that started in 1993. Then it's a game series, and then the Netflix series just came out. So all of those are very, very good. I haven't read the books myself. I need to. I think they're collections of short stories, if I'm not mistaken. So all of the, and then Skyrim, I should back up and say that the Skyrim date, it came out in 2011, but it's also been re-released a million different times on every single platform available, so that one's kind of complicated to date as well. But 2011 is when it came out. So all of these, if you think about fantasy, it kind of emerges, the genre, as a reaction against the rise of modernity. It's pushing back. So all of a sudden you have the Industrial Revolution come in. Uh, Everyday life is disrupted and transformed profoundly. And as a result, instead of embracing these new technological things that are happening, these new advances in production and consumptive behavior, it is a kind of pushback, right? A lot of these have the mythic hero kind of archetype in it. It's discussed in your course reading, the first one that you're assigned on the syllabus. Uh, these kind of mythopoetic understandings or theories were developed by psychologists and narratologists and folklorists and anthropologists like Otto Rank and Lord Raglan, who were drawing influence from Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, who also influenced Carl Jung. Their influence shaped Joseph Campbell and his book, which sort of popularized these ideas, the Hero with a Thousand Faces. That book and Campbell even influenced George Lucas, who produced Star Wars, who probably influenced your understanding. Star Wars is an interesting mix of fantasy and sci-fi. It's kind of like Destiny if you're a gamer. It's this mix of magic and technology, grounded, speculative, but grounded in potential plausible technology, which would be sci-fi, versus fantasy, which involves uh, often but not always a kind of medieval, pre-modern world in which there's magic and often inspired by folklore, right? So that's fantasy in a nutshell. Then we get science fiction. So the prior to the word sci-fi being coined, the scientific romance was kind of the name of the genre. It would later be called science fiction. It's exemplified by a whole bunch of different authors from Verne to H.G. Wells. It was preceded by the Gothic novels of Herman Melville and Edgar Allan Poe, if I can talk. Mary Shelley's work Frankenstein came out in 1818. That's considered by many to be one of the very first works of science fiction. Um, but it's a speculative genre that looks at the promises and the consequences of technology. So, science fiction, the term is coined in the 1920s and 30s by Hugo Gernsback, who we'll talk about here in a little bit. And you may have heard of the awards, the Hugos. They're in, his an award administered in his honor. The term sci-fi was coined in 1954 by Forrest Ackerman, who, along with Myrtle Douglas, are the first two people, if depending on how you want to date this, in 1939, they're the first individuals to do what we would define as cosplaying, which would be, if you want to be strict about it, dressing up as a pop culture character at a convention in a public sort of setting. So it's kind of interesting, all of these little connections between different individuals in this time period. All right, so some of those authors I mentioned, kind of the founding fathers, if you will, of science fiction. Although I wouldn't put Arthur Conan Doyle here as a father of science fiction. If someone mentions quote unquote the father of science fiction, they mean Verne, Wells, and then Gernsback, who's going to be on the next slide. So Verne, he was a French author. He wrote a number of novels: Journey to the Center of the Earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Around the World in 80 Days. You've probably heard a few of those or seen filmic adaptations of those. Doyle, British writer and actually a medical doctor as well. He's best known for his work with Sherlock Holmes. That sounds like he worked with him as an associate. He wrote short stories and novels and collections about the adventures of Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Actually, Sherlock Holmes was one of the first sort of fan campaigns to bring a character back. Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes. Fans went absolutely nuts. They were missing their favorite character, and they wrote a whole series of letters to, I believe it was the Stern magazine, to get him to continue producing more short stories. But he also wrote science fiction stories. H.G. Wells on the right, he was a British writer. He's actually the person who coined the phrase "the time machine," which is from his work "The Time Machine," "The Island of Dr. Moreau," "The Invisible Man," of which there was just another adaptation, and "The War of the Worlds," which has been adapted for a bunch of different genres. So these are a few of the kind of early writers who were operating in this genre. And a lot of that work, and a lot of work of early science fiction, gets put out there into the public imagination and consciousness by virtue of Hugo Gernsback. So he was a Luxembourg-born American. He was an immigrant who came to America. He was an inventor, an editor, and a publisher. He wasn't really known as a writer as much as he was an editor and a publisher. He helped really popularize science fiction, principally through the founding of Amazing Stories in 1926. These early, cheaply printed pulp sort of fiction magazines were coming out because of advances in wood pulp paper technology and printing press technology. And then there was a whole bunch of writers who were available at the time who wanted to write. He combined all of these things and was able to produce, and other people operating in that market were able to produce cheap publications. And this one was the first targeting and focusing on science fiction. The World Science Fiction Convention, or WorldCon for short, administers or awards the Hugo Award for the best science fiction or fantasy literature every year. And when I said Forrest Ackerman and Myrtle Douglas were the first folks to be cosplayers, though the term didn't exist back then, they went to the first WorldCon in 1939. That's where they went to dress up in their costumes. And ironically, their costumes were Ackerman's was based on, I believe, a Jules Verne novel. So it's kind of funny how all these things connect and intermesh. All right, so now we're going to talk about escapism. So here's a little meme I made, right? Life's very complicated right now, and literally what I've been doing, in addition to doing work, is rewatching some of the MCU films to entertain myself since I can't leave my home, and playing Human Fall Flat, which if you've never played, it's quite cheap. Things like $8, and if you have a friend, you can play it. If you don't have friends, you should have friends, so it's important to human growth and development. But if you have a friend, you can play couch co-op, or you can play it, I think, online. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about pulp fiction or dime novels. So they had sort of their heyday from the 1800s up to the 1950s. They were the successor to serialized novels and the predecessor to the modern comic book. So these sorts of things were the kind of missing link between serialized novels and the modern comic book that you now know. Pulp magazines were called that because they were printed on inexpensive wood pulp paper, and it was typically sold at like a newsstand for 5 or 10 cents a pop. And they often would feature, I'm going to show you a couple covers, really bright, saturated cover art with provocative imagery. And it was almost always designed to appeal to their imagined target audience, their demographic, which was perceived to be an adolescent male. Right, so here are a few covers. Pulp magazines were effectively action and adventure stories. Sometimes they were horror stories. They depicted detectives and crime fighters, space captains on adventures, and weird tales of fantasy and horror. Many of the characters that were introduced in pulp magazines, for instance, like Buck Rogers or The Shadow, they became radio drama, the subject of radio dramas. Pulp comics, and then later their radio adaptations, got huge audiences. They attracted tons and tons of listeners and readers, and they offered a temporary break from the ginormous sense of uncertainty and precarity that resulted from the First World War and then the Great Depression. So again, you can kind of probably see the parallels with our day-to-day lives now. Everyone's stressed, at least everyone I know, though I can't physically go see them. A lot of people are really stressed right now because of COVID-19 and seeing what's happening to the economy, and there's just a lot of anxiety and unsettledness, right? You don't know what's happening or what's going to happen. As a result, a lot of people are turning to binge watching things at home or playing video games like I am, going back to content that helps you kind of escape daily life and cope, for lack of a better word. All right, so comics were oftentimes printed in newspapers. Later, they got collected into particular collections. Comic Monthly was the first monthly comic book, which was published in 1922. A few years later, The Superhero is Born. Oh no, I didn't put it in parentheses after the word characters. Imagine that exists, because I'm not going to re-edit this. In 1938, right at the end of the Great Depression and just before the start of World War II, basically the prototypical, the archetypical superhero, Superman, is born. So whereas those pulp fiction texts had featured a protagonist with kind of ordinary abilities, Superman was extraordinary in every single way. He could fly, he could shoot lasers, he could blow really, really cold air. He could jump over a building in a single bound. He could do just about everything. He was indestructible, effectively. So the creators of Superman, they drew inspiration from carnival strongmen and figures from different kinds of folklore and mythology, particularly characters or figures like Samson and Hercules. The author and creator was Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They established the modern superhero as a being with abilities and powers that were far above and beyond what any normal human being could hope to do. So originally, these early comic books were again kind of like pulp magazines, kind of targeted at young kids. And we're going to jump over a whole heck of comic book history. This isn't a class about comic books, but it's one of the things that we're looking at this week. But comic books, like a lot of different things, like video games or toys or dressing up in a costume or playing board games or any of these number collectibles, all this sort of stuff, it was viewed oftentimes at its inception as entertainment or products for children. Later, those children grow up and they become adults and they have, hopefully, you have an expendable income and you can, continue to collect those things. When I was a child, I collected Jurassic Park toys like you would not believe. And as an adult, if you come to my office, which you shouldn't and can't do now, my office is filled with, dinosaur toys because it connects me back to my childhood. I have a sense of nostalgia when I look at those objects, and you probably do this with yourself. Remember when you brought your object into class for our artifact analysis day? You attach memories to these things, even though they're mass-produced consumer objects. But anyway, these things, all of these things, fantasy, science fiction, all sorts of kinds of forms of popular culture, help human beings to escape the trials and tribulations of everyday life, which in some ways is an important function or a kind of equipment for living, which is what Burke was trying to get at. All right, so there's the kind of intellectual, quote unquote, I'm doing quotey fingers, imagine me doing those, part of today's lecture. What I want you to do after this, make sure you watch that Dirty Machines, that's the name of the video, on YouTube. The link is on the syllabus, as I said earlier, and on the course website. I'm also going to post an additional thing that you are not required to watch. If you want to and you want to write notes about it, you certainly can. It's going to be about the history of comic books. It's available on YouTube for free and it's accessible. So I'm just going to post that in the most recent announcement. So when I post this video, that announcement will go live and you'll be able to see that video. So in case you're bored and stressed and you want to know a little bit more about the history of comic books, you can watch that. Likewise, I might do this for the rest of the semester, depending on how long we're quarantined. Movie, game, or whatever suggestions. So things that are relevant to the topic at hand, mind you. If you're interested in watching some good quality science fiction films, there are a lot more than are, posted here. Here are just a few. Alien and Aliens are excellent. The Martian, Terminator, and Terminator 2 are superb. Inception, Arrival is amazing. If you are going to watch Arrival, please do not read anything about it. Just rent it or find it on a streaming service and watch it. It's got a major spoiler in it. It's very interesting. Ex Machina is great. The Matrix is great. You could skip the next two. The Animatrix is pretty good. Blade Runner, as well as Blade Runner 2049, is exceptional. Children of Men, kind of a downer. You might not want to watch it right now, but also there's hope at the end of the film, perhaps, maybe. I don't know. The film Moon is lovely. If you have any sort of anxieties about teeth, you might avoid it. Jurassic Park Classic from 1993, I believe, and Gattaca. Gattaca is really good if you're thinking about social inequality. And if you want to think about healthcare and social inequality, too. Anyway, if you want to think about some fantasy content, if you want to burn away a large chunk of your day, rewatch all of the extended cuts of Lord of the Rings. Pan's Labyrinth is excellent. The Never-Ending Story, in fact, does end, and I believe it's like an hour and a half. It's a really good film. For me, it's a film that I grew up with. If you didn't grow up with it and you watch it now, you might not like it, just like The Dark Crystal, but there is a Netflix series of Dark Crystal. Same thing to say with Labyrinth. If you love David Bowie and you want to see Muppets, watch Labyrinth. How to Train Your Dragon, the Harry Potter series, or Willow, which is a pretty great film that a lot of people don't know about. Anyway, I'm tired of talking. You've made it to the end of the video. Congratulate yourself by, I don't know, like thumbs-upping yourself or high-fiving yourself, or just go confront yourself in the mirror and say, good job, you. All right, you've made it. Good job. Have a great day. Wash your hands.